A ver, otra vez. Acá sería acá, y acá sería acá, y acá sería acá. Ok, se supone que ya estamos. A ver quién se conecta. Y me dicen que todo está bien. Conexión excelente, dice. A ver. Bueno, ya debería comenzar, así que vamos a comenzar también por acá. Rueda de prensa, comunicado, FOMC. Ya va a comenzar, ¿ah? Ok, tenemos 4 usuarios otra vez. Perfecto. Díganme si se escucha bien. Le voy a poner en el chat. Díganme si se escucha bien, se ve bien. Ya me conecté ahora sí desde el celular. Debería estar mejor la conexión. ¿Vale? Respóndenme, porfa, para estar seguro que todo está bien. Ya, se ve bien, se escucha bien, perfecto, excelente, listo. Entonces, ya comenzó. Voy a apuntar mis notas acá, ok. Lo voy a tener acá al costado. Confírmenme si pueden ver mi pantalla y pueden ver la conferencia de prensa, ok. Confírmenme si esto se puede ver, si la conferencia de prensa se puede ver. Confirmen, ok. Ahorita voy a volver a ver el chat. Vamos a escribir notas por acá. A ver si se ve bien.
Good afternoon. My colleagues and I are strongly committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal. We have both the tools that we need and the resolve it will take to restore price stability on behalf of American families and businesses.
Espérense.
Price stability is the responsibility of the Federal Reserve and
Ellos
serves as the
buscan
bedrock of our economy.
restablecer la estabilidad de los
Without price
precios.
stability, the economy does not work for anyone. In particular, without price stability, we will not achieve a sustained period of strong labor market conditions that
Ok, sin estabilidad de precio no van a poder mantener la estabilidad de los mercados laborales.
basis points, and we continue to anticipate that ongoing increases will be appropriate.
Ajá, 75 puntos básicos hacia adelante es lo adecuado que ellos consideran que está bien.
In addition, we're continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet.
Ajá, ahí habla justamente de reducir el balance sheet o los activos que ellos tienen justamente en sus cuentas. Lo que hemos mencionado hace un momento.
Monetary policy actions after briefly reviewing economic developments. The U.S. economy has slowed significantly from last year's rapid
La economía norteamericana ha disminuido bastante en el último año.
quarter, but is unchanged so far this year. Recent indicators point to modest growth of spending and production this quarter.
Que tienen los indicadores actuales muestran que hay todavía fuerza en la producción y en el consumo.
Financial conditions. Activity in the housing sector has weakened significantly, largely
La actividad en el sector de bienes raíces se ha disminuido bastante.
also appear to be weighing on business fixed investment. Despite the slowdown in growth, the labor market remains extremely tight.
Ok, dice, a pesar de que el crecimiento se ha reducido, ellos ven todavía mucha fortaleza en el sector de mercado laboral.
Average of 289,000 jobs per month over August and September. Although job vacancies have moved below their highs and the pace of job gains has slowed from earlier in the year, the labor market continues to be out of balance.
Ok, menciona que a pesar de que efectivamente se ha reducido el mercado laboral, pues aún todavía está bastante bien.
Participation rate is little changed since the beginning of the year. Inflation remains well above our longer run goal of 2%.
La inflación se mantiene muy por encima de su objetivo del 2%,
Rose 6.2%, excluding the volatile
6.2.
food and energy categories.
Ese es el PCI, ¿no? El core, el que le quitas alimentos y algo más que no escuché.
Have come in higher than expected. Price pressures remain evident across a broad range of goods and services.
Ok, sí se ve pues presiones de los precios en servicios, comida, y esto es por la guerra, incrementado por la guerra que estamos viendo entre Rusia y Ucrania.
Longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored, as reflected in a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures from financial markets. But that is not grounds for complacency. The longer the current bout of high inflation continues, the greater the chance that expectations of higher inflation will become untrue.
Ok, el mayor tiempo que todas estas presiones se mantengan, el mayor tiempo vamos a tener presiones inflacionistas.
Employment and stable prices for the American people. My colleagues and I are
Ok, lo que ellos buscan es mantener precios estables y fuerte trabajo, sector laboral.
especially for those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials like food, housing, and transportation.
Especialmente para poder controlar los costos de transporte, comida y algunos servicios.
And we're strongly committed to returning inflation to our 2% objective.
El objetivo es retornar la inflación al 2% otra vez.
The federal funds rate by 75 basis points. And we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet.
Menciona lo mismo de reducir el balance sheet, la hoja de balance de la Reserva Federal, o sea, vender bonos.
We've raised interest rates by 3.75 percentage points this year. We anticipate that ongoing
Sí, es 3.75.
will be appropriate in order to attain a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2% over time.
Sí, mencionó lo de subir las tasas de interés actualmente a 3.75%.
Seeing the effects on demand in the most interest rate sensitive sectors of the economy, such as housing. It will take time, however, for the full effects of monetary restraint to be realized.
Va a tomar tiempo de todas maneras el ver los efectos de esta política monetaria en la vida real, ¿no?
Increases in the target range. We will take into account the cumulative tightening of monetary policy and the lags with which monetary policy affects economic activity and inflation. At some point, as I've said in the last two press conferences,
está leyendo esto, me parece.
Pace of increases as we approach the level of interest rates that will be sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation down to our 2% goal. There is significant uncertainty around that level of interest rates.
Bueno.
Even so,
dice que hay bastante incertidumbre
coming data since our last meeting suggests that the ultimate level of interest rates will be higher than previously expected. Our decisions will depend on the totality of incoming data and their implications for the outlook for economic activity and inflation. We will continue to make our decisions meeting by meeting and communicate our thinking as clearly as possible.
Básicamente que sus decisiones se van a basar en lo que vean de información económica que vayan recibiendo.
Our overarching focus is using our tools to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored.
Ok, lo que ellos quieren hacer básicamente es utilizar todas sus herramientas para mantener la inflación por debajo del 2% y mantener estable justamente esta inflación en el largo plazo.
Essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices in the longer run.
Sí, otra vez, precios estables y fuerte mercado laboral en el largo plazo.
The job is done. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Ok, al final dijo lo mismo, ¿no? Que buscan mantener los precios, la inflación controlada y van a hacer todo lo posible para hacerlo sin afectar a las familias en general, es lo que dijo.
At some point, is a downshift contingent on a string of better inflation data specifically between now and, let's say, the December meeting? Or is that something that the Fed could potentially proceed with independent of that data, given the lagged effects that you mentioned?
So a couple of things on that. We do need to see inflation coming down decisively, and good evidence of that would be a series of down monthly readings. Of course, that's what we'd all love to see, but I've never thought of that as the appropriate test for slowing the pace of increases or for identifying the appropriately restrictive level that we're aiming for.
Un ratito.
Need to bring our policy stance down to a level that's sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation down to our 2% objective over the medium term. How will we know that we've reached that level? Well, we'll take into account the full range of analysis and data that bear on that question, guided by our assessment of how much financial conditions have tightened, the effects that tightening is actually having on the real economy and on inflation, taking into consideration lags, as I mentioned. We will be looking at real rates, for example, all across the yield curve and all other financial conditions, and as we make that assessment.
Ok, la chica le pregunta ¿qué van a medir para definir si los tipos de interés se siguen incrementando en el siguiente mes. Y él dice, ¿no? Lo mismo que hemos hablado hace un rato, van a seguir mirando toda la información que reciben para llegar al objetivo, y en particular van a también mirar las curvas de interés de los bonos, justamente, US Treasury Yields, las curvas de rendimiento.
Along the way. So I think you can think about our tightening program as really addressing three questions. The first of which was, and has been, how fast to go. The second is how high to raise our policy rate. And the third will be eventually how long to remain at a restrictive level. So on the first question, how fast to tighten policy, it's been very important that we move expeditiously, and we have clearly done so. We've moved 3.75% since March, admittedly from a base of 0. It's a historically fast pace, and that's certainly appropriate.
Está mencionando que subieron de 0 a 3.75 de la manera más rápida históricamente hablando.
Second question, which is how high to raise our policy rate, and we're saying that we'd raise that rate to a level that's sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation to our 2% target over time, and we put that into our post-meeting statement. Because that really does become the important question, we think now, is how far to go. And
ellos consideran que la política a la que están utilizando es suficiente para alcanzar su objetivo. Aquí yo estoy interpretando de que no van a subir tanto más realmente.
The meetings, both the strong labor market report, but particularly the CPI report, do suggest to me that we may ultimately move to higher levels than we thought at the time of the September meeting. That level is very uncertain, though, and I would say, we're going to find it over time. Of course, with the lack in policy and economic activity, there's a lot of uncertainty. So we note that in determining the pace of future increases, we'll take into account the cumulative tightening of monetary policy as well as the lags with which monetary policy affects economic activity and inflation. So I would say as we come closer to that level, move more into restrictive territory, the question of speed becomes less important than the second and third questions. And that's why I've said at the last two press conferences that at some point it will become appropriate to slow the pace of increases.
Acaba de decir que según la data que van a seguir recibiendo, en algún momento les va a parecer adecuado el reducir el ritmo de incrementos de tasas de interés. Eso está interesante porque hace un momento también mencionó el hecho de que la data pues está relativamente bien, ¿no? Que está llegando data fuerte.
Much less important than the question of how high to raise rates and how long to keep monetary policy restrictive, which really will be our principal focus.
If I could follow up on that, to what degree was there an importance or weight given to a need to signal this possibility now, given all the concerns really around the globe about Fed policy sort of driving ahead and everybody else, dealing with their own stress as a result?
Well, I think I'm pleased that we have moved as fast as we have.
Estoy orgulloso de haber reaccionado tan rápido como reaccionaron.
That our current level is too tight, given that inflation still runs well above the federal funds rate. So I think that at this meeting, the last two meetings, as I've mentioned, I've said that there would come a point, and this was a meeting at which we had a discussion about what that might mean, and we did discuss this, and as I mentioned, we'll discuss it again in December. But there's I don't have any sense that we've over-tightened or moved too fast. I think it's been good and a successful program. That we've gotten this far this fast. Remember, though, that We still think there's a need for ongoing rate increases, and we have some ground left to cover here.
Acaba de decir de que él considera que han subido bastante bien el ritmo con el que han hecho la subida, o sea, hasta 3.75 desde marzo, y que todavía considera hacer las subidas hacia adelante.
6-month annualized basis and on a 12-month basis has been running in the high fours, close to 5%. Is there any reason to think you won't have to raise rates at least above that level to be confident that you are imparting enough restraint to bring inflation down?
Le hizo la pregunta sobre cuánto más va a tener que subir.
This is the question of does the policy rate need to get above the inflation rate? And I would say there are a range of views on that. That's the classic Taylor principle view. But I would think you'd look more at a forward-looking measure of inflation to look at that. But I think the answer is we'll want to get the policy rate to a level where the real interest rate is positive. We will want to do that. I do not think of it as the single and only touchstone, though. I think you put.
No, está mencionando ahorita de que lo que busca es que la tasa de interés final esté por encima de la inflación. O sea, que van a subir hasta que la tasa de interés esté por encima de la inflación. Eso muestra que pueden subir mucho más realmente.
Spreads are larger, so borrowing rates are significantly higher. I think financial conditions have tightened quite a bit. So I would look at that as an important feature. I'd put some weight on it, but I wouldn't say it's something that is the single dominant thing to look at.
If I could follow up, what is your best assessment or the staff's best assessment right now of the current rate of underlying inflation?
I don't have a specific number for you there. So there are many models that look at that. And I mean, one way to look at it is that it's a pretty stationary object, and that when inflation runs above that level, for sure, substantially above for some time, you'll see it move up, but the movement will be fairly gradual. So I think that's what the principal models would tend to say. But I wouldn't want to land on any one assessment. There are many different, as you know, people publish an assessment of underlying inflation.
Thank you.
Vamos a aprovechar en ver.
Hi, Chair Powell. Thank you for
¿Están ahí
taking our
hasta ahí?
questions. Gina
Ok,
Smiley,
se
New York
ve,
Times.
notas en paralelo,
I wonder, do you
ok.
see any evidence at this stage that inflation is or is at risk of becoming entrenched?
Me parece que entendí que se está viendo algún riesgo de que la inflación se mantenga pegada a la economía.
To expectations. So if we saw longer-term expectations moving up, that would be very troubling. And they were moving up a little bit at the middle part of this year, and they've moved now back down. That's one piece of data.
Ok, y las expectativas de inflación a largo plazo, eso en algún momento pues se vio que las expectativas de inflación a largo plazo eran mayores, pero que ya están bajando.
As indicative, but they may be important in the wage setting process. There's a school of thought that believes that. So that's very concerning. I guess the other thing I would say is that the longer we're now 18 months into this episode of high inflation. And
Que estamos 18 meses en esta alta inflación.
a clearly identified scientific way of understanding at what point inflation becomes entrenched. And so, the thing we need to do from a risk management standpoint is to use our tools forcefully but thoughtfully and get inflation under control, get it down to 2%, get it behind us. That's what we really need to do and what we're strongly committed to doing.
Ajá. Ya, era justamente lo que les decía, ¿no? O sea, la pregunta era cómo ves si es que la inflación o si él cree que la inflación se pueda quedar atascada en la economía, ¿no? O sea, que persista. Y él menciona que una forma de ver eso es viendo los salarios y sí, les preocupa bastante, ¿no? Y que hay varios modelos que se están evaluando justamente para eso, que anteriormente se vio subiendo la inflación, pero que actualmente se ha visto que está bajando y hay como que chances de que no se quede afianzada. Sin embargo, están viendo eso. Uy, espérense.
And that it works first on financial conditions and then on economic activity and then perhaps later than that even on inflation. So that's been the thinking for a long time. There was an old literature that made those lags out to be fairly long. There's newer literature that says that they're shorter. And, the truth is we don't have a lot of data of inflation of this high in what is now the modern economy. One big difference now is that it used to be that you would raise the federal funds rate financial conditions would react, and then that would affect economic activity and inflation. Now, financial conditions react well before, in expectation of monetary policy. That's the way it has moved for a quarter of a century, is in the direction of financial conditions, then monetary policy, because the markets are thinking, what is the central bank going to do? And there are plenty of economists that also think that once financial conditions change, that the effects on the economy are actually faster than they would have been before. We don't know that. I guess the thing I would say is it's highly uncertain. And so from a risk management standpoint, it would be irresponsible not to ignore them, but you want to consider them, but not take them literally. So I think it's a very difficult place to be, but I would tend to want to be in the middle, looking carefully at what's actually happening with the economy, and trying to make good decisions from a risk management standpoint, remembering, of course, that if we were to over-tighten, we could then use our tools strongly to support the economy. Whereas if we don't get inflation under control because we don't tighten enough, now we're in a situation where inflation will become entrenched, and the employment costs in particular, will be much higher potentially. So from a risk management standpoint, we want to be sure that we don't make the mistake of either failing to tighten enough or loosening policy too soon.
And if I could follow up.
Ok, la pregunta que le hizo a la chica no la escuché, pero él estaba hablando de cómo iban a manejar el riesgo, de si subir mucho la tasa de interés o subir poco, y cómo eso podría afectar la economía, ¿no? Entonces él estaba mencionando que históricamente los modelos antes, los mercados financieros reaccionaban a lo que hacía el Banco Central de Reserva, pero que ahora se ve que los mercados financieros reaccionan antes, en expectativa de lo que va a hacer los bancos centrales. Entonces no se tiene algo seguro en respecto a eso, pero que como parte de su manejo del riesgo van a estar monitoreando los resultados de su política. Ahora, también mencionaron que el subir con todo y controlar eventualmente la inflación, pues igual al final les permite utilizar todas sus herramientas extras como Banco Central para poder mantener la economía a flote, ¿no? Versus que no utilizar todas sus fuerzas como Banco Central de Reserva, que podrían estancar la inflación, o sea, estancarla, mantenerla en el largo del tiempo, y así pues no podrían utilizar sus herramientas, las herramientas de las políticas monetarias expansivas que ya lo vimos el domingo, ¿no? Entonces ahí justamente habla de eso, ¿no? Que él considera mejor el ser muy agresivo, porque así te daría paso de que a pesar de que te bajes la economía lo puedes levantar. En el caso contrario no se puede, pues, ¿no? Porque si la inflación está atascada y no está subiendo los tipos de interés de manera fuerte, pero la inflación sigue ahí, no tienes cómo solucionarlo, ¿no? A ver.
That might cause problems down the road.
I don't know that the channels through which policy works have changed that much. I would say a big channel is the labor market, and the labor market is very, very strong, very strong. And households, of course, have strong balance sheets. And so we go into this with a strong labor market and excess demand in the labor market, as you can see through many different things, and also with households who have strong spending power built up. So it may take time. It may take resolve. It may take patience. It's likely to get inflation down. I think you see from our forecasts and others that it will take some time for inflation to come down. It'll take time, we think. Sorry, was I getting to your question there? Oh, housing, the housing part of it. Yeah, so, we look at housing. Of course, housing is significantly affected by these higher rates, which are really back where they were before the global financial crisis. They're not historically high, but they're much higher than they've been. And you're seeing housing activity decline. You're seeing housing prices growing at a faster rate, and in some parts of the country declining. I would say the housing market was very overheated for the couple of years after the pandemic as demand increased and rates were low. We all know the stories of how overheated the housing market was, prices going up, many, many bidders, no conditions, that kind of thing. The housing market needs to get back into a balance between supply and demand. We're well aware of what's going on there. From a financial stability standpoint, we didn't see in this cycle the kinds of poor credit underwriting that we saw before the global financial crisis. Housing credit was very carefully, much more carefully managed by the lenders. So it's a very different situation and doesn't present doesn't appear to present financial stability issues. But no, we do understand that's really where a very big effect of our policies is.
Ok, estaba hablando ahorita, tampoco escuché la pregunta, pero hablaba del mercado de casas, el mercado de bienes raíces, y estaba mencionando que, o sea, claro, venía bastante ya recargado, o sea, los precios de las casas estaban subiendo mucho, inclusive desde antes de pandemia, ¿no? Y dice, ¿no?, que nosotros no vemos un riesgo crediticio como en el 2008, ¿no? Y pues por el momento no ven que sus subidas de interés traigan desestabilidad financiera, su política pueda traer inestabilidad financiera al sector de las casas de bienes raíces.
Unusually important in this cycle because it's been so out of line, but so has quits, so have wages. So we look at, a very wide range of data on the labor market. So, I'd start with unemployment, which is typically the single statistic you would look to, is at a 50-year low, 3.5%. We're getting really nothing in labor supply now. We had, I think, a very small increase this year, which we had really thought we would get that back. Most analysts thought we would get some labor supply coming in. You mentioned wages, so I guess I would characterize that as sort of a mixed picture. It's true with average hourly earnings you see, so I would call it a flattening out at a level that's well above the level that would be consistent over time with 2% inflation, assuming a reasonable productivity. There with the ECI reading this week, again, a mixed picture. The headline number was a disappointment. Let's just say it was high. It didn't show a decline. There's some rays of light inside, that if you look at private sector workers, that did come down, that compensation did come down. But overall, though, the broader picture is of an overheated labor market where demand substantially exceeds supply. Job creation still exceeds, the sort of the level that would hold the market where it is. So that's the picture. Do we see? We keep looking for signs that sort of the beginning of a gradual softening is happening. And maybe that's there, but it's not. It's not obvious to me because wages aren't coming down; they're just moving sideways at an elevated level, both ECI and average hourly earnings. We want to see. We would love to see vacancies coming down, quits coming down. They are coming down. Vacancies are below their all-time high, but not by as much as we thought because, and that the data series is volatile. We never take any one reading. We always look at 2 or 3. So it's a mixed picture. I don't see the case for real softening just yet, but we look at, I guess as I just showed you, we look at a very broad range of data on the labor market.
So do you see wages as being a significant driver of inflation?
I think wages have an effect on inflation and inflation has an effect on wages. I think that's always been the case. There's always a going back and forth. The question is that really elevated right now? I don't think so. I don't think wages are the principal story of why prices are going up. I don't think that. I also don't think that we see a wage price spiral. But again, it's not something you can, once you see it, you're in trouble. So we don't want to see it. We want wages to go up. We just want them to go up at a level that's sustainable and consistent with 2% inflation. And we do think that given the data that we have, that this labor market can soften without having to soften as much as history would indicate through the unemployment channel. It can soften through job openings declining. We think there's room for that, but we won't know that'll be discovered empirically.
Ok, igual y me comentan, voy anotando estas cosas para que ustedes las vayan yendo mientras las escucho, cosa que creo yo que les puede servir mientras lo van esperando mi traducción. Básicamente la chica le estaba preguntando sobre los salarios, ¿ok? Y él le dice, ¿no?, que tenemos bastante oferta de labor entrando y en realidad pues no hay una reducción de lo que es la oferta de trabajo, ¿no? Entonces, si bien ve que hay demanda mayor que la oferta, en el sector de trabajo hay bastante creación de trabajo todavía. Todavía vemos algunos pequeños, vamos a decir, graduales signos de que el sector de trabajo se está suavizando, o sea, está reduciendo su crecimiento, pero también están viendo que los salarios están bajando, ¿no? En realidad lo que él dice es una idea mezclada, ¿no? Y no ve pues que realmente en este momento el mercado laboral se esté suavizando en este momento. La chica le pregunta si los altos salarios, si él considera que son unos drivers, o sea, lo que mueve la inflación hacia arriba. Él dice que no, por el momento. Sin embargo, pues esto solamente te das cuenta cuando ya estás en el problema, ¿no? Lo que no queremos es que el incremento sea incontrolable, pero dada la información que tienen, el mercado laboral pues podría suavizarse, pero realmente no lo saben.
And we have an economy where inflation is running at 5%, core PCE inflation, which is a really good indicator of what's going on for us, is the way we see it, is running at 5.1% on a 12-month basis and sort of similar to that on a 3, 6, and 9-month basis. So we know that we need to use our tools to get inflation under control. The world's not going to be better off if we fail to do that. That's a task we need to do. Price stability in the United States is a good thing for the global economy over a long period of time. Price stability is the kind of thing that pays dividends for our economy for decades, hopefully. Even though it may be difficult to get it back, getting it back is something that provides value to the people we serve for the long run.
If I could just follow up on that. Thank you. The Fed has acknowledged in the past that the tools that you have don't affect things like energy and food prices that stem from some of those conflicts overseas, and they're some of the biggest pain points for consumers. So as you pursue the current path that you've outlined, is there a risk that some of those prices simply don't come down?
So we don't directly affect, for the most part, food and energy prices, but the demand channel does affect them just at the margin. The thing about the United States is that we also have strong, in many other jurisdictions, the principal problem really is energy. In the United States, we also have a demand issue. We've got an imbalance between demand and supply, which you see in many parts of the economy. So our tools are well suited to work on that problem, and that's what we're doing. You're right, though. We don't, the price of oil is set globally, and it's not something we can affect. I think by the actions that we take, though, we help keep, longer-term inflation expectations anchored and keep the public believing in 2% inflation by the things that we do, even in times when energy is part of the story of why inflation is high.
Ok. La chica le pregunta si pues ellos son conscientes de que hay riesgo de que los precios no caigan debido a que las herramientas de la Fed no afectan realmente el punto de dolor de los consumidores, ¿no? Como lo es energía y comida. Y bueno, y él dice, sí, efectivamente no, nosotros no afectamos los precios de las comidas, uno de los principales problemas es el de energía. Nuestras herramientas están bastante bien posicionadas para solucionar eso, pero pues que igual el precio del combustible es seteado globalmente, ¿no? Y que Estados Unidos, la Reserva Federal, no tiene control sobre eso, básicamente.
Sure. So you're right. The public's trust is really the Fed's and any central bank's most important asset. And anytime one of us, one of the policymakers, violates or falls short of those rules, we do risk undermining that trust. And we take that very seriously. We do. So at the beginning of our meeting yesterday, actually, we had a committee discussion of the full committee on the importance of holding ourselves individually and collectively accountable for knowing and following the high standard that's set out in our existing rules with respect to both personal investment activities and external communications. And we've taken a number of steps, and I would just say we do understand how important those issues are. I would say that our new investment program that we have is up now and running, and actually it was through that the problems with President Bosik's disclosures were discovered when he filed his new disclosures. That's we now have a central group here at the Board of Governors that looks into disclosures and follows them and approves people's disclosures and also all of their trades. Any trade anyone has to make who's covered has to be pre-approved. And there's a lag. It has to be pre-approved 45 days before it happens, so there's no ability to game market. So it's a really good system. It worked here. And I think we all said to each other yesterday morning, we recommitted to each other and to this institution to hold ourselves to the highest standards and avoid these problems.
Do you have an update?
O sea, le estaba preguntando, él estaba hablando sobre los problemas adentro de la Fed, de las compras, ventas o el trading institucional. Institucional no es la palabra. De los mismos trabajadores del Banco Central de Reserva y sus asociados, ¿no? Y comentan, ¿no?, que la confianza del público es uno de los más activos más importantes y pues que ahora ellos tienen un grupo de personas que están chequeando todas las actividades de trading que hagan los representantes de la Fed y estas tienen que ser aprobadas 45 días antes de que pasen, ¿no? Ese es un método que han implementado para evitar los problemas de conflicto de intereses.
Explanatory power, and you said, quote, if it's inverted, that means the Fed's going to cut, which means the economy is weak. That curve is only 2 basis points away from inversion now, so I'm wondering why you are so confident that you have not over-tightened, particularly given that rates work with a lag.
Well, so we do monitor the near-term forward spread, you're right. And that's been our preferred measure. We think just empirically, it dominates the ones that people tend to look at, which is 2s, 10s, and things like that. So it's not inverted. And also, you have to look at why the rate curve is doing what it's doing. It can be doing that because it expects cuts or because it expects inflation to come down. In this case, if you're in a situation where the markets are pricing in significant declines in inflation, that's going to affect the forward curve. So yes, we monitor it. You're right, and that's what I would say.
No le dijo nada. El man le pregunta si no cree que que la inversión de las curvas actuales es una muestra de que la política ya es muy dura y el man le dijo it's not inverted, que no está invertida. No entiendo. ¿No se supone que ya está invertida? Ya lo vimos ya que está invertida.
And we've raised interest rates by 375 basis points. I would not change a word in that statement, though. I think until we get inflation down, you'll be hearing that from me. Again, if we over tighten, and we don't want to, we want to get this exactly right. But if we over tighten, then we have the ability with our tools, which are powerful, to, as we showed at the beginning of the pandemic episode, we can support economic activity strongly if that happens, if that's necessary. On the other hand, if you make the mistake in the other direction and you let this drag on, then it's a year or two down the road and you're realizing inflation behaving the way it can, you're realizing you didn't actually get it, you have to go back in. By then, the risk really is that it has become entrenched in people's thinking, and the record is that the employment costs, the cost to the people that we don't want to hurt, they go up with the passage of time. That's really how I look at it. So that isn't going to change. What has changed, though, you're right, is we're farther along now, and I think as we're farther along, we're now focused on that. What's the level we need to get to rates, and I don't know what we'll do when we get there. By the way, we'll have to see. There's been no decision or discussion around exactly what steps we would take at that point, but the first thing is to find your way there.
Ok, le dijo ahorita que lo más importante básicamente es llegar con todo por debajo del 2%, ¿no? O sea, eso es lo más importante, ¿no? Y justamente menciona lo que les mencioné hace un rato. Esto no es overnight, es overdue. Él menciona que si se pasan con el tema de las subidas de las tasas de interés, bueno, en ese caso ellos tienen sus herramientas, como lo hicieron en la pandemia, para levantar la economía, ¿no? Por el otro lado, si no eres lo suficientemente restrictivo y subes las tasas de interés, la inflación se mantendría y entonces tendrías que subir eventualmente las tasas de nuevo. Esto haría que el costo de vida de la gente sea alto por más tiempo, ¿no? Se ha quedado alto, vamos a poner acá, por más tiempo, y eso le dañaría a la gente, ¿no? ¿Esperen?
It captures rents for all tenants, not just new leases. And that makes sense, actually, because for that reason, that conceptually, that's sort of the right target for monetary policy. And the same thing is true for owner's equivalent rent, which comes off of, it's a reweighting of tenant rents. The private measures are of course good at picking up at the margin, the new leases. And, they tell you a couple things. One thing is I think right now, if you look at the pattern of that series of the new leases, it's very pro-cyclical. So rents went up much more than the CPI and PCE rents did. And now they're coming down faster. So the implication is that there are still, as non-new leases roll over and become and expire, right? There's still in the pipeline, there's still some significant rate increases coming. Okay, but at some point, once you get through that, the new leases are going to tell you that what they're telling you is there will come a point at which rent inflation will start to come down. But that point is well out from where we are now. So we're well aware of that, of course, and we look at it. And but I would say that in terms of what the right way to think about inflation really is to look at the measure that we do look at, but considering that we also know that at some point you'll see rents coming down.
Great. And just a quick follow. It looks like stock and bond markets are reacting positively to your announcement so far. Is that something you wanted to see? Is that a problem, or how that might affect your future policy to see this positive reaction?
We're not targeting any one or two particular things. Our message should be, what I'm trying to do is make sure that our message is clear, which is that we think we have a ways to go. We have some ground to cover with interest rates before we get to that level of interest rates that we think is sufficiently restrictive. And putting that in the statement and identifying that as a goal is an important step. And that's meant to put that question really as the important one now going forward. I've also said that we think that the level of rates that we estimated in September, the incoming data suggests that that's actually going to be higher. And that's been the pattern. I mean, I would have little confidence that the forecast, if we made a forecast today, if we were doing an SEP today, the pattern has been that one after another, they go up, and, that'll end when it ends. But there's no sense that inflation is coming down. It just, if you look at I have a table of the last 12 months of 12-month readings, and there's really no pattern there. We're exactly where we were a year ago. So, okay. So I would also say it's premature to discuss pausing, and it's not something that we're thinking about. That's really not a conversation to be had now. We have a ways to go. And the last thing I'll say is that I would want people to understand our commitment to getting this done, and to not making the mistake of not doing enough, or the mistake of withdrawing our strong policy and doing that too soon. So I control those messages, and that's my job.
Ok, le dijo algo súper interesante y lo estoy acá colocando en español. Confírmame que si lo pueden ver en el chat, por favor.
The headwind is all the fiscal spending to what the Federal Reserve is trying to do to get inflation back to the 2% target.
In theory, it was a headwind this year, but I do think the broader context is that you have households that have these significant amounts of savings and can keep spending. So I think those two things do tend to sort of counterbalance each other out. It appears consumer spending is still positive. It's at pretty modest growth levels. It's not shrinking, people are, the banks that deal with retail customers and many retailers will tell you that the consumers are still buying, and they're still, they're fine. So I don't know how big the fiscal headwinds are, and they haven't shown up in the way that we thought they would in restraining spending. So it must have to do with the savings that people have.
What about the spending? There's tens of billions yet to be spent. I mean, from the Inflation Reduction Act, the American Rescue Plan, CHIPS Act, bipartisan infrastructure bill. How does that play into your thinking about the future?
It's demand is going to have some support from those savings, and also from the strong demand that's still in the labor market. We still see pretty significant demand and a tightening labor market in some respects, although I think overall I would say it's not really tightening or loosening. So we see those things, and what those things tell us is that, you know, our job is going to require some resolve and some patience over time. We're going to have to stick with this. You know, that's just, we take all that as a given, but we know what our objective is and we know what our tools can do, and that's how we think about it.
Thanks. We'll go to Nancy for the last question.
Hi, Chair Powell, Nancy Marshall-Genzer from Marketplace. I'm wondering, has the window for a soft landing narrowed? Do you still think it's possible?
Has it narrowed? Yes. Is it still possible? Yes. I think we've always said it was going to be difficult, but I think to the extent rates have to go higher and stay higher for longer, it becomes harder to see the path. It's narrowed. I would say the path has narrowed over the course of the last year, really. Hard to say. Hard to say. You know, again, I would say that the sort of array of data in the labor market is highly unusual, and to many economists, there is a path to, ordinarily there's a relationship to GDP going down and vacancies declining, translating into unemployment, or there's Okun's law. So all those things are relationships that are in the data, and they're very real. Data's a little bit different this time, though, because you have this tremendously high level of vacancies, and we think on a very steep part of the beverage curve. All I would say is that the job losses may turn out to be less than would be indicated by those traditional measures because job openings are so elevated and because the labor market is so strong. Again, that's going to be something we discover empirically. I think no one knows whether there's going to be a recession or not, and if so, how bad that recession would be. And you know, our job is to restore price stability so that we can have a strong labor market that benefits all over time, and that's what we're going to do.
But just real quickly, why do you feel like?
Because we haven't seen inflation coming down. The implication of inflation not coming down, and what we would expect by now to have seen is that as the supply side problems had resolved themselves, we would have expected goods inflation to come down by now, long since by now, and it really hasn't. Although it has come down, but it's not to the extent we had hoped. At the same time, now you see services inflation, core services inflation moving up, and I just think that the inflation picture has become more and more challenging over the course of this year, without question. That means that we have to have policy be more restrictive, and that narrows the path to a soft landing, I would say.
Ok, un momento. A ver, no al nivel que ellos desean. Dijo que nadie sabrá si hay recesión. Su trabajo es hacer que el sector laboral se mantenga bien. Oh, ya acabó. Interesante. Ok. A ver, ¿qué dice la gente? ¿Qué dice la gente por acá por el chat? Me comentan. Voy a terminar de anotar estas cosas que vi ahorita. ¿Qué tenemos por acá? ¿Qué teníamos por acá? Bueno, ya. Le había preguntado si si la posibilidad de tener un aterrizaje suave se han reducido. Él dice sí, que sí es posible. Sí, todavía dice eso, ¿no? Que las tasas de interés van a seguir subiendo por más tiempo y tenemos, y esto porque se ha visto un alto nivel de vacantes para trabajos. Las pérdidas de trabajo no se notan porque el sector de trabajo está fuerte. Nadie sabrá si hay recesión, es lo que dijo. Su trabajo es hacer que el mercado laboral se mantenga bien. Han visto que la inflación está bajando, no al nivel que ellos desean, pero igual lo están viendo. La inflación de servicios está creciendo. Todo el tema de la inflación este año, me acuerdo que dijo, es más retador this year. Por eso tenemos que tener paciencia, seguir con la política de seguir subiendo las tasas. En fin, básicamente eso. Realmente, no sé ustedes, yo no puedo sacar una conclusión en realidad de lo que ha dicho. O sea, básicamente menciona que va a poder seguir subiendo las tasas, pero no está claro, ¿no? No está claro hasta dónde, hasta cuándo. Realmente no encuentro algo que sea como que decisivo, la verdad. Así que, a ver, vamos a ver qué hay en los bonos, en las acciones, a ver qué ha pasado. Vamos a darle una mirada al SPX. Wow, el SPX se bajó hasta 3800. Wow, no me había percatado de esto. ¿Cómo está el QID? A ver si estamos haciendo plata o no. Wow, está en 26 ya. Buen rendimiento del hedge que puse ayer. Qué bueno. Por eso mismo justamente es estar preparados para cualquiera de los dos resultados, ¿no? Para mí el mensaje es que van a seguir subiendo las tasas y que ven el mercado lo suficientemente. Es más, lo voy a colocar acá ya. Lo voy a colocar acá. A ver, vamos a colocarlo acá. Ya, entonces, a ver, mi conclusión, igual esta es mi opinión, es de lo que acabo de escuchar, me falta revisar más información, los twitters y todo, pero a ver, mi conclusión es que ellos ven el mercado, la economía lo suficientemente fuerte como para seguir subiendo tipos de interés, ¿ok? Y no ven ninguna razón para eventualmente bajar el ritmo de las tasas de interés en el corto plazo. Eso es lo que yo entendí del audio, de toda la charla en resumen. Entonces, si esto es así, la subida de tasas va a ser más alta no necesariamente más alta, pero la subida de tasas se va a mantener, ¿sí? Es decir, no va a haber 0.5%, o mejor dicho, 50 puntos básicos en el siguiente mes. Eso es lo que yo he entendido, que no va a haber 50 puntos básicos en el siguiente mes. Y la subida de tasas se va a mantener probablemente al mismo ritmo, ¿ok? Entonces, si nosotros nos cerramos en estas tres ideas nada más, entonces yo no diría que el mercado crashee, voy a poner acá, no creo que el mercado haga un crash. Probablemente lo que estamos viendo aquí es un tema de volatilidad, aunque bueno, estamos viéndolo caer fuertemente, ¿ah? Estamos viéndolo caer fuertemente. Y ya rompió este nivel de acá que era súper importante, miren. Que está acá y está acá. ¿Cuál es el siguiente punto? Me parece que los siguientes niveles es este, ¿no? Sí, es este de acá aproximadamente. Yo diría inicialmente que se va a controlar acá. Más o menos en este rango. Si es que llega a bajar más, ¿no? Porque acá también tenemos un soporte, miren. ¿Ok? Acá también tenemos un soporte. Y pues para cerrar mi idea, no creo que el mercado haga un crash como hasta los 3.500. Lo dudo porque no lo veo como que la historia se ponga más fea de la que ya está. Dudo más que rompa ese piso de 3.500, como les digo. Lo veo muy poco improbable volver a 3.300 por el momento. Ese es lo que estoy considerando ahorita. Entonces nada, habría que ver pues cómo se va comportando, porque al final, como les dije, todo esto es volatilidad, todo esto es interpretación, ¿ok? Entonces nada, seguimos por el chat y espero que les haya gustado el live. Lo hice, ya saben, siempre lo mejor que pude. Y si les gusta esto, si les gustó este evento, no se olviden de dar like. Dejen su like por acá, sus comentarios. Gracias por estar acá conmigo. Y ya saben que el domingo nosotros tenemos un evento, ¿ok? Pongan en su calendario este domingo a las 8 de la noche, ¿ok? Pongan live Club de las 7 cifras, ¿ok? Los quiero ver ahí, ya saben de que va a haber descuento, promoción para el curso básico. Dale, así que entonces nos vemos este domingo. Chau, chau.